At 35,000 feet above the dark Atlantic Ocean, something impossible was happening. Both pilots were unconscious. 153 passengers had no one to fly the plane. The cabin filled with panic as the announcement echoed through the speakers. "We need any pilots on board to come forward immediately." Then a quiet woman from row 22 stood up. She had never flown a commercial jet before, but she was their only hope. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The Boeing 767 moved smoothly through the night sky. Its small lights blinked against the darkness. Inside the cabin, most of the 153 passengers were sleeping. Their seats were pushed back. Blankets covered their bodies. They trusted the two pilots sitting behind the locked cockpit door. The pilots would take them safely across the ocean to London in the morning. The overnight flight from Boston had been normal so far. The air was smooth. The weather was clear. This was the kind of regular flight that happens thousands of times every day. It was so reliable that passengers never thought twice about it. Sarah Chen sat in seat 22C. It was an aisle seat in the middle section of economy class. Her reading light created a small circle of brightness in the dark cabin. She was a woman in her early 50s. Her short dark hair was starting to show some gray. She wore jeans and a comfortable navy blue sweater. She looked completely ordinary. She looked like any other passenger on the plane. The man in seat 22B was named Michael. He had introduced himself when they were boarding. He asked if she was traveling for business or pleasure. She smiled and said simply, "Visiting family." This was true. She had a cousin in London. She did not add any details about her background. Michael nodded and put in his earbuds. That was their only conversation. He was sleeping now, his head against the window, snoring softly. Sarah had accepted the dinner service earlier. She said thank you quietly. She chose the chicken instead of the pasta. She said no to the wine with a polite shake of her head. Then she settled in with a paperback mystery novel from the airport bookstore. To anyone watching her, she was exactly what she looked like. A middle-aged woman on a regular flight across the Atlantic. Unremarkable in every way. Someone you would sit next to and forget before the plane even landed. The flight attendants who served her dinner would not remember her. She was polite but not chatty. She did not ask for special treatment. She gave them no reason to remember her among the 153 faces they were serving. But what none of the passengers knew was the truth about Sarah Chen. Sarah Chen had spent 23 years as one of the best test pilots in United States military history. She flew experimental aircraft that were classified secrets. Aircraft that had number codes instead of names. Aircraft that pushed the limits of what was possible in the sky. She tested planes that regular pilots never got near. She took prototypes through dangerous maneuvers. Maneuvers that would have destroyed normal aircraft. She developed emergency procedures for situations that had never happened before in aviation history. She had landed aircraft with broken hydraulic systems. She had flown planes with damaged control surfaces. She had restarted engines at altitudes where restart was supposed to be impossible. She had recovered from spins that should have been impossible to recover from. She brought home prototype aircraft that were still learning how to fly. She wrote technical reports that became the basis for emergency procedures taught to fighter pilots around the world. Procedures that saved lives in combat because she figured out the solutions first. Her military record included 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses and a Legion of Merit. She received commendations from 3 different Air Force Chiefs of Staff. They recognized her contributions to aviation safety and aircraft development. She was the first woman to test fly several classified aircraft programs. She pioneered techniques for handling computer flight control failures. She trained a whole generation of test pilots who now held senior positions throughout military aviation. Her name appeared in classified documents as the lead pilot on programs that would not be publicly known for another 20 years. She retired from active test operations 5 years ago at age 47. She moved to consulting work that kept her name out of public records. Her expertise was known only to a small circle of defense contractors and military aviation specialists. She preferred it that way. The attention that came with awards and pioneering work had always made her uncomfortable. She did the work because she loved flying and solving impossible problems. Not for recognition or fame. The test pilot community understood this. They were all driven by the same passion for pushing boundaries. Not by desire for public attention. Anonymity suited her perfectly. She could travel without being recognized. She could have normal conversations without people asking about her career. She could live quietly without being treated as exceptional. She had seen too many retired pilots struggle with civilian life because they became too identified with their military identity. She was determined to avoid that trap. The book in her hands was actually quite good. A well-plotted thriller about international spies. She was absorbed in a tense scene when she noticed something change. Years of test flying had given her an almost supernatural awareness of aircraft behavior. She could detect problems before instruments showed them. Before other pilots even sensed something was wrong. It was a sixth sense developed through thousands of hours of flight time. Flight time in aircraft that were often unstable or unpredictable. Survival depended on recognizing the earliest signs of developing problems. Right now, something felt wrong. She could not immediately identify what. The engine tone was normal. The aircraft was level. There was no vibration or unusual sound. But something in the pattern of flight deck activity had changed. She had been unconsciously tracking the rhythm of radio transmissions. The normal periodic communications between the cockpit and air traffic control. That rhythm had stopped. Then she heard it. The barely noticeable change in engine tone. Not exactly a problem. But a shift that suggested the autopilot had made a small course correction. That was normal enough. Aircraft made small adjustments constantly. But that kind of correction should have been followed by a radio transmission to air traffic control. The pilot should have informed them of the deviation. She waited, listening carefully. But she heard nothing. The aircraft continued its steady flight through the night. The cabin remained dark and peaceful around her. She told herself she was being paranoid. Decades of test flying had made her too sensitive to every small variation. This was a commercial flight with experienced pilots. Not an experimental prototype on its first flight. Commercial aviation was the safest form of transportation ever developed. With backup systems built on backup systems. With procedures refined through millions of flight hours. She returned to her book. But part of her mind remained alert. Monitoring the subtle signs that most passengers would never notice. 40 minutes later, Senior Flight Attendant Jennifer Martinez walked toward the cockpit. She carried a tray with 2 cups of coffee and light snacks. The pilots had requested these for their scheduled crew break. It was 2:47 a.m. Nearly 3 hours into the 7-hour flight. Jennifer had worked this Boston to London route many times. She knew the routine perfectly. The pilots would be alert and professional. Probably discussing the route or weather ahead. Maybe sharing stories about their families or previous flights. Maintaining the careful attention that kept everyone safe. She pressed the intercom button outside the cockpit door. She waited for the standard response. Nothing. She pressed it again. Holding it longer this time. Counting 5 seconds in her head. Still no response. A small flutter of concern moved through her chest. The Post 9/11 security rules meant the cockpit door was reinforced steel. It was designed to resist battering rams and even small explosives. It was locked from inside with multiple backup systems. The pilots had to unlock it from inside for anyone to enter. This security measure prevented hijackings. But it created other problems. She picked up the interphone and dialed the cockpit extension. Through the handset, she could hear it ringing inside the flight deck. The distinctive sound that should have gotten immediate response. But nobody answered. The phone rang 6 times. Then 7. Then 8. The flutter of concern became real worry. She knocked on the door. 3 sharp knocks that should have been clearly heard inside. Even over the ambient cockpit noise. No response. Jennifer's mind raced through possibilities. Each one more worrying than the last. Radio failure? No, that would not prevent them from hearing the intercom or the phone or her knocking. Medical emergency? But both pilots at the same time? That seemed almost impossible. The entire reason for having 2 pilots was that both could not be incapacitated together. Could they both be in the bathroom? No. Rules required at least 1 pilot in the cockpit at all times. And besides, she would have seen one of them leave. She knocked again. Harder this time. Using her fist to create as much noise as possible. Captain. First officer. This is Jennifer with your crew break service. Please respond. Silence. Complete, terrifying silence from behind that reinforced door. Her hands were shaking now. She entered the emergency access code into the keypad beside the door. The system was designed with a 30-second delay. This gave the pilots time to override the entry if there was a security threat. If someone had obtained the code under pressure. If unauthorized people were trying to enter. But if the pilots did not respond, the door would unlock automatically after the countdown. She watched the seconds count down on the small display. Her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. 20 seconds. 15 seconds. The pilots could still cancel the entry. They were not canceling. 10 seconds. Why were they not canceling? 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet cabin. Jennifer pushed the door inward and stepped onto the flight deck. What she saw made her blood turn to ice. Both pilots were slumped in their seats. Captain James Morrison's head was tilted forward against his chest. His chin rested on his tie. First Officer David Park was leaning back. His mouth was slightly open. His arms hung loosely at his sides. Neither one moved. Neither one reacted to the door opening. Neither one reacted to her presence. The instrument panels glowed with their normal colored displays. Screens showed flight information and navigation data. The autopilot indicator showed a steady green light. Everything looked completely normal. Except for the 2 unconscious men who were supposed to be flying the aircraft. Captain Morrison. Jennifer's voice came out sharp with panic. Louder than she intended. She grabbed his shoulder and shook him hard. His body moved under her hands. His head rolled slightly. But he did not wake. Did not respond at all. Did not even make a sound. She moved to the first officer. Shaking him with both hands. Her fingers digging into his shoulders. David. Wake up. Please wake up. David. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Both men were breathing. She could see their chests rising and falling with regular rhythm. But they were completely unresponsive. Locked in some deep unconsciousness that her urgent shaking could not break. It was as if they had been drugged. Or were in some kind of coma. Their bodies present, but their minds completely absent. Jennifer felt the world tilt around her. Reality became something surreal and nightmarish. She was looking at an impossible situation. A nightmare that was not supposed to be possible in modern commercial aviation. 2 pilots. Specifically 2 pilots so that if one became unable, the other could take over. Dual pilot incapacitation was the scenario that aviation authorities had always dismissed as too unlikely to worry about. But here it was. Both of them. Both unconscious at the same time. How was that even possible? She grabbed the interphone with shaking fingers. Pressing the button for the back galley where two other senior flight attendants were preparing breakfast service. Maria. Julie. I need you in the cockpit right now. Emergency. Drop everything and come now. Her voice cracked on the last word, betraying the terror she was trying to control. Within 90 seconds, 3 senior flight attendants were crowded onto the flight deck. All 3 were staring in absolute horror at the unconscious pilots. Maria Rodriguez had been flying for 18 years. She had seen medical emergencies, turbulence injuries, even a passenger heart attack. She had never seen anything like this. Julie Thompson was newer to the job but trained in emergency medical response. She immediately began checking vital signs. Maria grabbed the emergency oxygen bottle from its mount. She tried to give oxygen to Captain Morrison, holding the mask over his face. "They're breathing," Maria said. Her fingers on the captain's neck, checking his pulse. "Heart rate seems normal. Strong and regular. But they're completely out. I cannot wake them at all." "Carbon monoxide?" Julie suggested, her voice tight with fear. "Could there be a leak in the cockpit?" "The cabin sensors would have alarmed," Jennifer said. But even as she spoke, she was looking at the environmental control system display, checking for any sign of contamination. Everything showed normal. Green lights everywhere. Cabin pressure normal. Oxygen levels normal. Temperature normal. "Could be the oxygen system," Maria added, her mind racing through emergency training. Something in their masks. Some kind of contamination. Or the cockpit air supply. Something that affected them but not us because we breathe cabin air that comes through different filters. They worked frantically for 5 minutes, trying everything they had been trained to do in emergency medical response courses. They shook the pilots harder. They gave pure oxygen from the emergency bottle. They checked for obvious injuries or signs of trauma. They loosened their collars and ties. They called their names repeatedly in voices that grew more desperate. Nothing produced even a small response. Both men remained deeply, completely unconscious. As unreachable as if they had been put to sleep for surgery. Finally, Jennifer straightened up, her face pale under the harsh cockpit lighting. "The autopilot is flying the plane right now. But if anything happens, weather, traffic conflict, system failure, we have no one to handle it." She paused. And eventually. She did not finish the sentence. But they all knew what she meant. Eventually, the aircraft would need to descend from cruise altitude. Eventually, it would need to fly an approach. Eventually, it would need to land. And unconscious pilots could not do any of those things. "We need to make an announcement," Maria said quietly, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "Ask if there are any pilots on board. There has to be someone. Commercial pilots travel all the time." Jennifer nodded, her throat tight. She had been a flight attendant for 14 years. She had handled medical emergencies and difficult passengers and mechanical problems. But she had never imagined making this kind of announcement. She picked up the PA handset. She took a deep breath that did nothing to steady her racing heart. She pressed the call button. The chime rang through the cabin. That familiar ding-dong sound that usually meant routine information about seatbelts or turbulence. It woke some passengers from sleep. It got the attention of others who had been reading or watching movies. In seat 22C, Sarah Chen's head came up immediately. Her body went alert. Years of emergency operations had programmed this into her reflexes. That chime at this hour meant something unusual. And unusual during flight often meant dangerous. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Senior Flight Attendant Jennifer Martinez. The woman's voice was controlled. But it carried an edge that made passengers sit up straighter. Made conversation stop instantly. Made people pull out earbuds and pause movies. We have an unusual situation that requires immediate assistance. Both of our pilots have become incapacitated and are currently unconscious. The aircraft is flying safely on autopilot. But we urgently need anyone with pilot qualifications to identify themselves and come to the cockpit immediately. She paused. I repeat. We need any qualified pilots to make themselves known to the crew right away. This is an emergency situation. The cabin exploded with sound. Gasps. Exclamations. People talking over each other in rising panic. A woman 3 rows ahead of Sarah began crying. Her sobs loud in a confined space. A man across the aisle was demanding to know how both pilots could be unconscious. His voice aggressive with fear. Children were asking their parents frightened questions. A teenager was frantically texting despite the no cell phone rules. The businessman in 22B woke with a start. Confused and disoriented. What's happening? Michael stammered. Looking around wildly. Sarah Chen sat perfectly still. Her mind was already working through the implications. Working with the cold analytical precision that test pilot training had built into her. Dual pilot incapacitation was extraordinarily rare. But not impossible. Contaminated oxygen supply. Pressurization failure affecting the cockpit. Food poisoning if they ate something different from the cabin crew. Carbon monoxide leak isolated to the flight deck. Biological agent. Chemical exposure. The cause mattered less right now than the immediate reality. A Boeing 767 with 153 people on board was flying on autopilot with no conscious crew to manage it. Autopilot could maintain altitude, heading, and speed. It could follow a programmed route through waypoints. But it could not make decisions. It could not respond to air traffic control requests for altitude changes. It could not adjust for weather. It could not handle system failures. It could not execute holds or changes in route. And it absolutely could not land the aircraft. Not with the kind of precision required for a safe touchdown on a runway. She could hear the announcement being repeated. She could hear the growing panic in the cabin around her. Parents were pulling children close. People were praying. Someone was screaming. The flight attendants would be looking down the aisles. Desperately hoping to see someone stand up and identify themselves as a pilot. But Sarah knew the statistics. The chances of another qualified pilot being on this particular flight were slim. Commercial aviation was a small world. Most pilots were either working on other flights or not traveling during their time off. The man in seat 22B had gone white. His eyes wide with terror. Did she just say both pilots are unconscious? How is that even possible? What are we going to do? Sarah did not answer immediately. Her mind was running calculations. She had approximately 4,000 hours of flight time. Accumulated over 2 decades of intensive test operations. But almost none of it was in commercial aircraft. Her experience was in military test operations. Experimental fighters. Prototype bombers. Aircraft that barely existed yet outside of engineering drawings and computer models. She had logged some time in trainer aircraft that had similar characteristics to commercial jets. She had done some civilian flight instruction early in her career. But she had never flown a 767 specifically. She had never flown any commercial aircraft in actual operations. She knew the systems conceptually. She knew the principles of flight that applied to any aircraft regardless of size or type. But there would be differences in procedures. In avionics interfaces. In the way this specific aircraft responded to control inputs. But she also knew something else. She might be the only person on this aircraft with any realistic chance of managing the situation. At least until help could be arranged. Test pilot training was specifically designed for handling aircraft you had never flown before. For figuring out systems on the fly without instruction manuals. For solving problems that had never been encountered before. It was training built for the unknown. For the impossible. For situations that exceeded all normal limits and required improvisation based on fundamental principles rather than memorized procedures. She closed her book carefully. She marked her place. She stood up. The passenger in 22B looked at her in surprise. Hope flickering across his terrified face. "Are you a pilot?" "Yes," Sarah said simply. Her voice calm and steady. She started moving toward the front of the cabin. The cabin erupted again as people realized someone was responding to the call. Passengers were standing. Leaning into the aisle to see who was walking forward. Craning their necks for a view. Some were calling out questions. Their voices overlapping. "Are you really a pilot? Can you fly this plane? Are we going to be okay?" Others were reaching out as if to touch her for reassurance. Their hands grasping at her sleeves as she passed. Sarah kept her expression calm and confident. More for their benefit than from any feeling of confidence herself. She moved with purposeful speed. Not running but not hesitating either. Jennifer Martinez saw her approaching from her position at the front of the cabin. She stepped forward immediately. Hope and desperation mixing in her expression. "You're a pilot." "Test pilot." "Retired," Sarah said quietly. Keeping her voice low so nearby passengers would not hear the qualification. 23 years military aviation. "I need to see the cockpit immediately." Jennifer's eyes widened slightly. Test pilot was not the same as commercial pilot. She knew enough about aviation to understand the difference. But it was infinitely better than nothing. Infinitely better than no pilot at all. She gestured urgently toward the cockpit door. "This way. Please. Quickly." They moved through the forward galley. Past the curtain that separated the cabin from the working area. Jennifer opened the cockpit door. Sarah stepped onto the flight deck and immediately began a systematic visual scan. Her test pilot training taking over automatically. Both pilots unconscious. Slumped in their seats exactly as described. Primary flight display showing autopilot engaged. Altitude 35,000 feet. Airspeed 280 knots. Heading 290 degrees. Navigation display showing the aircraft tracking along its programmed route toward waypoint Natex. Fuel quantity showing approximately 43% remaining. Roughly 3 hours of flight time. All engine instruments in normal range. Both engines running smoothly. No warning lights. No caution messages. No master warning or caution illuminated. No obvious system failures. She moved closer to the captain's seat. Checking his condition with clinical detachment. Breathing normally. Chest rising and falling with regular rhythm. She pressed 2 fingers to his neck. Pulse strong and regular. Approximately 70 beats per minute. She lifted his eyelid carefully. Pupil response normal. Reactive to light. Not suffering from lack of oxygen. Not obviously injured. No signs of trauma. She checked the first officer with the same systematic approach. Found the same results. Whatever had knocked them out, it had not killed them. It did not appear to be causing immediate medical crisis beyond the unconsciousness itself. "How long have they been unconscious?" Sarah asked. Her voice calm and professional despite the severity of the situation. "We discovered them about 8 minutes ago," Jennifer replied. Her voice shaking slightly. "We've been trying everything to wake them. Shaking them. Oxygen. Calling their names. They're not responding to anything we've tried. Sarah nodded, continuing her assessment. She checked the oxygen system panel. Flow normal to both crew positions. No indication of contamination or system failure. She checked the cockpit environmental controls. Temperature 22 degrees Celsius. Pressure equivalent to 8,000 feet cabin altitude. All within normal parameters. She checked the interphone system. Working properly. Dial tone present. The radio stack showed the last frequency selected was Boston Center on 135.45. But the volume was turned up and there was no indication the pilots had been responding to calls. The autopilot mode control panel showed the aircraft in LNAV and VNAV mode, following the programmed lateral and vertical navigation. She reached up and pressed the transmit button on the radio. Boston Center, this is Skybound 273 Heavy. Do you copy? The response came immediately, crackling with urgency and relief. Skybound 273, Boston Center. We've been trying to reach you for 15 minutes. Say status immediately. Sarah took a breath. Boston Center, Skybound 273. Be advised both flight crew are unconscious and unresponsive. I am a passenger with military test pilot qualifications who has assumed coordination responsibility. Both pilots are breathing and stable but completely unresponsive to all revival attempts. Aircraft is stable on autopilot at flight level 350. Tracking route is filed. All systems appear normal. Request immediate medical guidance and aviation support. There was a moment of dead silence on the radio. Sarah could almost hear the collective sharp intake of breath from every controller listening to the frequency. Then. Skybound 273, Boston Center copies all. Stand by for emergency coordination. Be advised we are treating this as highest priority emergency. Sarah knew that right now, across the entire East Coast air traffic control system, alarm bells were going off. Both literally and figuratively. Every available resource was being scrambled. Medical teams would be consulted about how to revive the pilots. Aviation experts would be pulled in to provide technical support. Military coordination would be initiated to potentially shadow the aircraft with chase planes. Company operations would be alerted. The entire system would be mobilizing around this unprecedented situation. She turned to Jennifer, who was standing just inside the cockpit door with Maria and Julie. All three flight attendants looking at her with expressions mixing hope and terror. I need you to keep trying to revive the pilots. Use any methods the medical team suggests. Any change in their condition, even minor, eye movement, muscle twitch, change in breathing, you tell me immediately. She paused. I also need you to brief the other flight attendants. Keep the passengers as calm as possible. But they need to understand the situation is serious. Everyone needs to follow crew instructions without question. No panic, but no false reassurances either. Truth with calm. Jennifer nodded, though her hands were shaking. Can you actually fly this aircraft? I mean, you said test pilot, not commercial pilot. Sarah looked at her directly, knowing that honesty was more important than false confidence. I've never flown a 767 specifically. I've never flown any commercial aircraft in actual operations. But I've flown aircraft that were far more complex and far less stable than this. I've flown prototypes that were still figuring out their flight characteristics. She paused. I can manage the systems and coordinate with ground support. The question isn't whether I can fly it. The question is whether I can land it if the pilots don't wake up. And I won't know the answer to that until we try. The honesty seemed to steady Jennifer more than false confidence would have. She nodded again. More firmly this time. She left the cockpit with the other flight attendants, pulling the door closed behind her, maintaining separation from the anxious passengers beyond. Sarah Chen settled into the first officer's seat, adjusting it for her smaller frame. At 5'6", she was shorter than most male pilots. The seat had been set for someone taller. She adjusted the seat height, moved it forward to reach the pedals comfortably, adjusted the backrest angle. The Boeing 767 cockpit was more modern than some of the older trainers she had flown early in her career, but less advanced than the latest experimental aircraft she had tested. It was a glass cockpit, with multifunction displays, electronic flight instruments, automated systems that would have seemed like science fiction to pilots from an earlier generation, but which were now standard in modern commercial aviation. She spent the next several minutes familiarizing herself with the layout, her test pilot training telling her to understand the environment before taking any actions. Primary flight display directly in front of her, showing attitude indicator, airspeed tape on the left, altitude tape on the right, heading display at the bottom, navigation display to her right, showing the flight plan route, current position, surrounding airspace, engine instrument centrally located between the two pilot positions, showing RPM readings for both engines, exhaust gas temperature, fuel flow, autopilot mode control panel on the glare shield above the instrument panel, radio stack between the seats, with multiple navigation and communication radios, throttle controls in the center pedestal, with thrust levers, speed brake lever, flap lever. The radio crackled with the air traffic controller's voice. Skybound 273, Boston Center. We have Dr. Patricia Walsh from our medical team standing by with guidance on pilot revival procedures. Also establishing contact with Boeing Operations Center and Military Aviation Support Command. Please confirm your qualifications in more detail for our records. Sarah reached for the transmit button, pressing it with her left hand while her right hand rested on the control wheel. Boston Center, Skybound 273. I am Sarah Chen, retired Lieutenant Colonel, United States Air Force. 23 years as developmental test pilot with Air Force Test Center at Edwards Air Force Base. 4,000 hours total flight time. Type rated in multiple military aircraft including T-38 Talon, F-15 Eagle, F-16 Fighting Falcon, F-22 Raptor, and various experimental platforms I'm not at liberty to identify over open frequency. She paused. I have systems familiarization with commercial aircraft through academic study and simulator time, but no specific type rating in the Boeing 767. I am comfortable managing aircraft systems and can execute basic flight maneuvers, but approach and landing procedures will require verbal guidance from experienced 767 operators. Another pause. Longer this time. Sarah could imagine the controllers conferring with supervisors. Aviation authorities scrambling to figure out how to handle this unprecedented situation. Then. Skybound 273, Boston Center. Understood and copied. We are locating retired 767 captains to provide real-time guidance. Military liaison confirms your service record. Stand by for medical consultation. A new voice came on the radio. Female. Professionally calm with the kind of steadiness that comes from years of handling medical emergencies. Colonel Chen, this is Dr. Patricia Walsh, flight surgeon with the FAA medical team. I need you to describe the pilot's condition in as much detail as possible. Respiratory rate, skin color, temperature, pupil response, any unusual odors in the cockpit, response to pain stimulus. Anything that might help us diagnose the cause of unconsciousness. Sarah relayed everything she had observed. Speaking with clinical precision learned from years of writing detailed test reports. The doctor asked follow-up questions, walking her through additional checks. Sarah instructed the flight attendants through the interphone to check additional vital signs, to look for any signs of seizure activity, To smell the pilot's breath for any unusual chemical odors. After several minutes of this detailed exchange, Dr. Walsh said. Colonel Chen, based on what you're describing, this doesn't appear to be lack of oxygen. Their oxygen levels seem adequate. It doesn't appear to be carbon monoxide poisoning. No cherry red skin color. No obvious signs of toxic exposure to common aviation hazards. She paused. The most likely scenario based on sudden onset affecting both pilots at the same time is some form of food poisoning that produced toxins affecting consciousness. Or potentially some chemical agent that affected both pilots but not the cabin crew. Possibly because they ate something different during their crew meal. Or potentially a very localized air quality issue. Something in the cockpit ventilation system that has since cleared through normal air circulation. Another pause. The good news is their vital signs are stable. The concerning news is we cannot predict when they'll regain consciousness. Could be minutes. Could be hours. Understood, Sarah replied. What revival procedures do you recommend we continue? Dr. Walsh outlined a protocol. Continued oxygen from the emergency bottle. Periodic physical stimulation without causing injury. Monitoring of vital signs every 5 minutes. Positioning to ensure airway remained clear. Sarah relayed the instructions to the flight attendants through the interphone. They resumed their efforts with the unconscious pilots. With renewed systematic approach. The next hour passed in a state of controlled tension that Sarah recognized from test flights where problems had developed mid-mission. She maintained continuous communication with air traffic control. Monitoring the aircraft's progress along its route. The autopilot was performing perfectly. Tracking the programmed course toward the waypoints that would eventually lead across the Atlantic toward Ireland and then to London. Fuel was being consumed at the expected rate. Approximately 5,000 pounds per hour. All systems remained absolutely normal. Engines running smoothly. Pressurization holding steady. Electrical systems functioning properly. Hydraulics showing good pressure. But Sarah knew this was temporary stability. Built on autopilot capability that had definite limits. The weather ahead included a line of thunderstorms developing over the mid-Atlantic. The autopilot could not navigate around them on its own. That would require pilot intervention to request routing changes. And eventually, inevitably, the aircraft would need to descend from cruise altitude. Would need to execute an approach procedure. Would need to land on a runway. Procedures that demanded conscious human control. That could not be delegated to automation, no matter how sophisticated. At 4:15 a.m., the radio brought welcome news. Skybound 273, Boston Center. We have Captain Robert Hammond joining us on the frequency. He's a retired 767 captain with 30 years experience on type. Including many years as a line check airman and simulator instructor. He'll be your primary aviation advisor for all technical questions. The radio continued. We're also patching in Major General Patricia Martinez from Air Force Special Operations Command who wants to speak with you directly. A moment later, a male voice came through the speakers. With the distinctive calm of a long-time professional pilot. Colonel Chen, this is Bob Hammond. I've been briefed on your situation and your qualifications. First, I want to say I'm impressed as hell that you're keeping that bird stable and communicating clearly under these circumstances. How are you holding up? Sarah felt some of the tension ease from her shoulders. Hearing an experienced voice who understood the technical challenges she was facing. Managing, Captain Hammond. Aircraft is stable. Systems normal. But we've got weather developing ahead and eventually we'll need to land this thing. That's what I'm going to need your help with. Roger that. And please call me Bob. We're going to get through this together. General Martinez is standing by to speak with you. Then you and I will start going through the 767 systems in detail so you're ready for whatever comes next. Another voice joined the frequency. Authoritative and familiar in a way that made Sarah's breath catch. "Chen, this is General Patricia Martinez. I reviewed your test reports on the Raptor program 5 years ago when I was at Air Combat Command. Outstanding work. Your analysis of the post-stall maneuvering characteristics probably saved lives in operational squadrons." She paused. "Never expected to find you in this situation. But if anyone can handle it, you can. You have full military support authorization. Air Force has scrambled KC-135 tanker and F-15 chase aircraft from Lodges Field in the Azores that can rendezvous with your position within 2 hours if needed. We're treating this as a priority national mission. Whatever you need, Colonel." "Appreciated, General," Sarah replied. Surprised by how much that support meant. How much it helped to know the entire weight of military aviation was being positioned to help. Having chase aircraft available for visual confirmation if systems issues develop would be valuable. The aircraft. For the next 2 hours, Captain Hammond walked her through the Boeing 767 systems with patient thoroughness. They discussed the autopilot modes and what each one did. The flight management computer and how to program route changes. The auto-throttle system and how it managed engine power. Approach procedures and what instruments to monitor. And most critically, landing techniques specific to the 767. Hammond explained the aircraft's handling characteristics. How it responded to control inputs. What speeds to maintain at various phases of flight. What sight picture to expect during approach. Where the touchdown zone should appear in the windscreen. The 767 is a very forgiving aircraft, Hammond told her. His voice reassuring. It's stable. Predictable. With good visibility from the cockpit. The flight controls are responsive but not twitchy. If you've flown fighter jets with fly-by-wire systems, you'll find this almost relaxing by comparison. He paused. The key is not to overthink it. Trust your instincts. The basics will carry you through. The aircraft wants to fly. Your job is just to guide it where it needs to go. Sarah appreciated his confidence. But she had seen too many test operations go wrong when pilots became overconfident in unfamiliar aircraft. She maintained her systematic approach. Memorizing procedures. Visualizing the approach and landing sequence. Preparing mentally for every problem she could imagine. At 6:30 a.m., with the sun beginning to paint the eastern horizon with streaks of orange and pink visible through the cockpit windows, the situation took an unexpected turn. Maria burst through the cockpit door. Her face flushed with excitement and hope. "Colonel Chen." Captain Morrison's eyelids just fluttered. And the first officer made a sound like a groan. They might be waking up. Sarah's heart leaped. But she kept her voice steady. "Keep monitoring them closely. Any change, no matter how small, you report immediately. Dr. Walsh, did you copy that?" "Affirmative, Skybound 273, came the doctor's response. "This is consistent with metabolic processing of whatever agent affected them. Continue the oxygen and stimulation protocol. Colonel Chen, maintain your position at the controls until we have confirmed recovery of at least one pilot to full consciousness and capability." The next 20 minutes felt longer than the previous 4 hours combined. Sarah maintained her position in the cockpit. One hand on the control wheel even though the autopilot was engaged. Monitoring every instrument and display with unwavering attention. Behind her, she could hear the flight attendants working with the pilots. Their voices rising with growing excitement. "Captain Morrison, can you hear me? Squeeze my hand if you can hear me. David, come on, wake up. That's it. Open your eyes." At 6:47 a.m., Captain James Morrison's voice came through the interphone. Weak and confused, but undeniably conscious. "What? What happened? Where am I?" Sarah felt relief wash through her like a physical wave. But she maintained her professional composure. Captain Morrison, this is Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen, currently occupying your first officer seat. You and First Officer Park became unconscious approximately 4 hours ago. I'm a passenger with military test pilot qualifications who has been coordinating with ground support. The aircraft is stable at cruise altitude. All systems normal. But you've been unconscious for an extended period. How do you feel? There was a pause. She could hear Morrison trying to process the information. Could imagine him struggling to understand how he had lost 4 hours of his life while his aircraft continued flying. I feel groggy. Weak. My head is pounding. Did you say you're a test pilot? Affirmative, sir. 23 years Air Force developmental testing. I've been managing systems and communications. But I've maintained autopilot engagement. Captain Bob Hammond, a retired 767-line Czech airman, has been providing technical guidance from the ground. We've had full support from Air Force Command as well. First Officer Park. Morrison asked. His voice gaining strength. Also regaining consciousness, Maria reported through the interphone. He's responding to questions. Appears oriented. Dr. Walsh's voice came through the radio frequency. Captain Morrison, this is Dr. Patricia Walsh, FAA flight surgeon. I need to assess your condition before you resume control of the aircraft. Can you tell me today's date, your location, and your destination? Morrison answered correctly. His responses becoming clearer with each passing minute. The doctor walked him through a series of tests. Checking his memory. His reasoning ability. His capacity to make complex decisions. After 15 minutes of detailed assessment, she gave her professional opinion. Captain Morrison, based on your responses and the flight attendant's observations of your physical condition, I'm cautiously clearing you to resume command. However, I strongly recommend you allow Colonel Chen to remain in the cockpit as additional support until you're confident in your full capability. You've experienced a significant medical event. While you appear to have recovered consciousness, we cannot rule out residual effects that might impair judgment or reaction time. Sarah began extracting herself from the first officer's seat. But Morrison's voice stopped her. Colonel Chen, would you mind staying right where you are? At least until we're on the ground? I'd appreciate having someone with your qualifications backing me up. Especially given that David is still pretty out of it. Happy to stay, Captain, Sarah replied. Settling back into the seat. Your aircraft. Your decision. Your command. I'm here to support however you need. Over the next hour, Captain Morrison gradually reasserted control of the situation. His decades of professional experience overcoming the fog of whatever had knocked him unconscious. Under Dr. Walsh's continued monitoring, he disengaged the autopilot. He flew the aircraft manually for several minutes. Testing his coordination and responses. His hands were steady on the controls. His decisions clear and appropriate. First Officer Park recovered more slowly. But was eventually able to resume his duties with reduced responsibility. Morrison handled the primary flying tasks. Sarah briefed Morrison on everything that had occurred during his unconsciousness. The fuel state. The communications with air traffic control. The weather ahead. The support assets that had been positioned. She explained how Captain Hammond had walked her through the 767 systems. How General Martinez had coordinated military support. How the entire aviation infrastructure had mobilized to support their emergency. Morrison listened with growing amazement. Occasionally shaking his head in disbelief. You kept my aircraft flying for 4 hours. Without ever having flown a 767 before. Colonel, that's remarkable. I don't know how to thank you. No thanks necessary, Captain, Sarah replied. I was just in the right place at the right time with the right background. Any pilot would have done the same. Any pilot couldn't have done what you did, Morrison insisted. Most commercial pilots would be lost in a military fighter. The reverse is equally true. The fact that you could bridge that gap, could apply test pilot principles to an unfamiliar aircraft type, that probably saved all our lives. At 8:15 a.m., with the Irish coastline visible ahead and London Heathrow only 90 minutes away, Captain Morrison executed a textbook approach briefing with First Officer Park. The weather at Heathrow was clear. Winds favorable. No operational complications beyond the medical emergency they had already survived. Sarah finally allowed herself to relax slightly. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the night beginning to fade. She watched Morrison work with professional admiration. He was smooth, precise, confident without being careless. The product of 30 years of experience. This was his world. His aircraft. His expertise. She had been a temporary bridge across an impossible gap. But now the proper order was restored. As they began their descent toward Heathrow, Morrison turned to her with a slight smile. "You know, Colonel Chen, I'm going to have one hell of a story to tell my grandkids." The night both pilots passed out over the Atlantic. And a retired test pilot saved everyone on board. Sarah smiled back. "Just tell them it was a team effort, Captain." Which it was. Air traffic control. Medical team. Captain Hammond. General Martinez. The flight attendants who never stopped trying to revive you. Everyone played their part. True, Morrison agreed. But you were the one sitting in that seat. Making it happen. That takes more than just training. That takes courage. The landing at Heathrow was smooth and uneventful. Emergency vehicles were positioned along the runway as a precaution. But they were not needed. Captain Morrison guided the Boeing 767 to a gentle touchdown. The passengers erupted in applause. Both pilots were immediately transported to a hospital for evaluation. Tests would eventually reveal that a rare bacterial contamination in their pre-flight meal had produced a toxin causing temporary unconsciousness. The food service provider would be investigated. New safety protocols would be implemented. Sarah Chen quietly collected her bag from the overhead bin. She planned to slip away unnoticed in the chaos of deplaning. But Jennifer Martinez found her at the door. "Colonel Chen. On behalf of the entire crew and all the passengers. Thank you. You saved our lives." Other passengers were listening. They began to applaud. The applause spread through the cabin. Sarah felt her face flush. This was exactly the kind of attention she had spent her career avoiding. But she smiled and nodded, accepting their gratitude with grace. As she walked through the terminal toward customs, her phone began buzzing with messages. News of the incident was already spreading. Her name had been released to the media. She sighed. Her anonymous retirement was probably over. But as she thought about those 153 passengers, the crying children, the terrified parents, the desperate flight attendants, she knew she would make the same choice again. Some situations called for a hero. Whether you wanted to be one or not. And sometimes, the hero was just a quiet woman in row 22. Who happened to have the right skills at exactly the right moment.